Section 4. Is color objectively real? Hofstadter expresses his objections to the inverted color spectrum as follows. First, he says that this hypothetical notion makes our inner experiences of sound and color like a set of floating, pre-existent pure abstractions that are not in any way related to physics. Secondly, quote, these inner experiences are arbitrarily mappable onto outside phenomena. As we grow up, the rainbow colors get mapped onto the spectrum of prefabricated feelings with which our brains all come equipped from the factory. But this mapping is not mediated by neural wiring. After all, neural wiring is observable from a detached third-person perspective, such as that of a neurosurgeon, so that rules it out, end quote. David Rose also reinforces Hofstadter's position by claiming that colors themselves have independent external characteristics which make the inverted spectrum unlikely. He points out that it's well known that red-green and blue-yellow oppose one another. We can also say that pink is in between red and white, and orange is in between red and yellow. These fixed color relationships always occur in people who have physiologically normal color vision. He adds, quote, there is a structure to our color experiences. Some pairs of colors are more similar than others. For instance, orange is more similar to red than it is to blue. Experimentally, one can measure the structure of people's color space by mapping out how similar the various colors are to one another. End quote. From all this, Rhodes concludes that, quote, this complete integrated structure means that individual bits of it cannot be isolated. You cannot swap red and green around without causing some disruption to the map or web of relationships between the other colors, end quote. Rose attacks the very concept of color underlying the inverted spectrum. He points out that human color space, quote, is not just a one-dimensional thing like the rainbow. Each color has its degrees of saturation, hue, and brightness. This forms a three-dimensional space, and there are several ways you could invert a three-dimensional space. Inverting one axis or several, or rotating the whole sphere around one or more axes. Most critically, it turns out that human color space is not exactly isotropic. It is not a perfect sphere, and the three axes are not quite at right angles to one another. Thus, the topology of an individual's color phenomenology cannot be altered without causing some noticeable difference to their observable behavior. However, the empirical evidence is that this does not happen unless the person has a particular color vision defect or problem. Humans are consistent in their color-related behavior. Since it is extremely unlikely that an alternative set of color qualia would give the same relational color space, the conclusion is that people do have similar kinds of absolute, not just relative experiences of color, and therefore people do not experience inverted spectra. End quote. Hofstadter then asks why it is that those who postulate the inverted spectrum always do so only from experiences that lie along a one-dimensional numerical scale. Quote, "It seems like a great paucity of imagination to limit oneself to swapping red and blue. If you think it's coherent to say to someone else, maybe your private inner experience of red is the same as my private inner experience of blue, then why would it not be just as coherent to say, maybe your private inner experience of looking at a red rose is the same as my private inner experience of looking at a blue violet?" End quote. Hofstadter then introduces some examples of inverted experiences that are not restricted to a one-dimensional numerical scale. He says, quote, "What is sacrosanct about the idea of shuffling colors inside a spectrum? Why not shuffle all sorts of experiences arbitrarily? Maybe your private inner experiences of redness is the same as my private inner experience of hearing very low notes on a piano. Or maybe your private inner experience of going to a baseball game is the same as my private inner experience of going to a football game. Then again, maybe your private inner experience of going to a baseball game is the same as my private inner experience of going on a roller coaster ride. Or maybe it's the same as my private inner experience of wrapping Christmas presents." End quote.